Welcome to the Academic Career Advancement Podcast. I am Dr. Loren M. Hill, your Academic Career Advancement Coach, and I am so happy to have with us today Dr. Natasha N. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is currently a faculty member, but we're going to get into what led her ultimately to ed, because she started off in K through 12, did a little stint there with middle school, found her way into the community college arena, and now is currently in the four-year space. So welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. Thanks for having me. It's great to connect with all of you today. It's a pleasure being here.
Yes, yes. Well, we are so excited. So we're going to get right into it. So I know you are from New York and have had some great experiences career-wise out there. And as I recall, you have always loved STEM from when you yourself were in school. And from there, you ended up kind of not necessarily purposefully, but it ended up being that you were teaching math in to middle schoolers.
Absolutely. So if I go back just a little bit, my high school, I went to Brooklyn Technical High School. And if you know anything about Brooklyn Tech, it is a school that is really focused on natural sciences, engineering, the science in general, technology. It's a school for STEM gems, whether you know it or not. And so even those early experiences, I didn't know then how it was going to come back full circle for me, but it ended up doing so. Not long after I graduated from New York University in 2000, I had a bachelor's degree in communications, ready to be the next Oprah, ready to take over the world. And what I didn't know then was just how difficult the job market was going to be for a communications major. Also, this is 2000. A lot was changing about the world around us. And so I find myself temping at first, just when I initially got out of school. And a year later, 2001, 9/11 happened. Among other things, so many changes going on in New York, so many changes, all the rules changing around the nation. And for me, what did that mean? It meant I didn't know that that phone call was going to come in not long after. A friend who began teaching that same year, did not have a background in education, but she did have a background in psychology, and called me up one day and said, Natasha, there's this teacher shortage. I don't know if you heard about it. All you need is a bachelor's degree. And just that conversation is what initially got that ball rolling. I found myself in the South Bronx that first year, fingerprinting, getting ready to become a teacher. And when I walked into a middle school in December of 2001 for what I thought was going to be an interview, I didn't realize then that it was going to be day one. And so my career as an educator began in that Bronx middle school in 2001, where I spent that first year teaching middle school science. The next year, I was back in Brooklyn and taught middle school science in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And so after those 2 years, all right, I'm teaching science. This is fun. This is great. But after school, I began working with my same science students on their math homework, just helping them out with their math homework after school. And that's when the light bulb hit. Said, I love teaching. I really should be teaching math. And so and still, I didn't open that next door. It was a colleague of mine who was leaving the school that year. She got a job at Eastside Community High School in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, not far from where I went to school at NYU, walking distance away. And I didn't even know that she noticed what I was doing in my classroom and with my students. And she said, aren't you the person teaching math, science? Well, they need someone like that at Eastside Community High School. Are you interested? Long story short, I end up there. I have a wonderful conversation with the principal, who still is looking for a math science cluster. And I promised him I can be a good math science teacher, but I could be a better math teacher. And they took me on. And for the next 5 years, I taught middle school, then high school mathematics at Eastside Community High School, and loved every bit of those 5 years, that the 7 in total. What a wonderful grounding that gave me as an educator, and en route to moving on to the next level.
I really appreciate this part of your life story and your career, because most of us who are in higher ed come in just straight to higher ed and talk about, career wise. Some of us have some experience with K through 12. And I think it's important to know that the educational lifespan is continuous, right? Even if there's a break. So knowing what happens in K through 12, and I'll even back it up further, TK, pre-K, whatever you want to, however it is in your community. But the moment that an individual starts their education to even beyond their institution of higher ed, talking about continuing education or life experience, all of this is very much informed by what happens in the first half. So you were a great math teacher. You love STEM. You were all for the sciences. You were doing stuff that most of us do extra, right? You're helping the kids with their homework. We do that in higher ed as well. Whether we send them to the tutor, we providing some type of additional support, championing them on. And all of that also, I think, helped to get you noticed, because you said you didn't even know that people were paying attention to you. And our listeners will find that that has been sort of a thread throughout your career. So you've wrapped up your time with K through 12. And so let's just go ahead and talk about your time in, community college. How did you end up with that position?
So
And how did it go?
at the time in which I was finished, so I was at Eastside Community High School from 2003 to 2008. And I go back to school because in New York City anyway, you need a master's degree if you want to remain in education. You can start with a bachelor's, but you're going to need a master's eventually. And so my clock was ticking. I had 3 options. I was looking at special ed, math ed, or becoming a counselor, and decided that counseling was the right route for me, because what it meant is that I can keep one foot in the classroom. I had my teacher licensures, but as a counselor now, I can really connect the two. And if you're a good teacher, you're a counselor anyway. So it was an opportunity to get paid to be a good counselor. Why? Yeah, that was useful because I met my husband in 2008 on a cruise. And people think that's funny. Was it a singles cruise? It was nothing like that. So we meet on the cruise, and just even in our first conversation, we saw how aligned we were with education, with our goals, with our trajectories. I was the teacher next door. He was the officer next door. All those things aligned. Why does that matter? Because not long after we met, I find myself moving to his hometown, Memphis, Tennessee. And we get married not long after that. But before that, I get to Memphis. I need to be gainfully employed. As fun as it is with all this past history, what does that mean? And how does that translate now that I'm out of Brooklyn, New York, and in Memphis, Tennessee? And so the very first job opportunity I got was at Northwest Mississippi Community College, about 45 minutes away in Senatobia, Mississippi. The
Mm.
question I got asked the most: how does somebody from Brooklyn, New York end up in Senatobia, Mississippi? And so I spent the next 2 years there. I was working with student support services as a counselor. There was a math lab right across the hall from where my office was located. So it didn't take me long to align with the math lab and continue to pick up working with students in the math lab whenever I had an opportunity. Whenever the resident counselors went on conferences, I took their classes because it was either that or some sub who they didn't know. They already had a licensed counselor in their midst. And that got me back in the classroom, not as a primary, but to continue to hone the skills that I'd already amassed as a teacher. And so between being a student support services counselor, working in the math lab, and being the resident backup person for the counselors whenever, they needed somebody to cover their classes, I would say that was 2 years well spent. So I really
Mm-hmm.
got to take all of that, the giftings, the abilities, the skills, the training, and focus on applying those at Northwest. When I got to Northwest, though, as much as I loved my time in K-12 and specifically 612, dealing with college students, working with them on that level, communicating with them on that level, having conversations about life beyond, I knew I wasn't going back. I knew at that point that I would remain in higher ed no matter where life took me forward.
Okay, so we've got the foundation, we've got, making ourselves available. We also have something that I think is what I have like to have people consider is relocation, right? So sometimes opportunities in life events and life circumstances can really dictate where you live, what you go, what have you. And so relocating is something that's not always easy for people to do, but when you are open to relocation, and can do it, new opportunities present themselves, and your skills that you've learned along the way are really transferable skill sets. So you've been in K through 12. Now you're in community college and you're seeing like, oh, math is math. It's just, it's just the age appropriateness, right? The students still need support, right? They just happen to be a little older now. So some of the counseling, and I love what you said about whether you are formally a counselor, meaning you have a credential or you've had some training in it, or informally, students are going to come talk to you about a whole bunch of stuff. You can either have like, I can't deal with that right now. Let me refer you over to student services, and there's nothing wrong with that, or you could maybe have a little bit of bandwidth and end up finding out what's going on with the students. But once you are in their midst, they are going to have some stuff to say about what's going on in their school life and then out of their school life. So we need to be prepared and cognizant about that. And frankly, some students in some demographics have more need for support in those areas as well, whether it's just, come on in here, let me listen to you for, a few minutes and then direct you on, or okay, come sit in my office every Thursday at 3. I have snacks available and I have tissue, right? So, okay, you are sold on higher ed, and and what you also was interesting about your career, as you had mentioned to me, in your heart, in your DNA, you're really a scientist, right? And I think that many of us who are in the academy are scientists because, you have to show me some research. I need to see the literature. You're not just going to come in here talking about, I mean, anecdotal stuff is fine, but we need some proof of stuff, right? And so, you may or may not have a lab, you may or may not have an area of focus that you do, but you really are, using and employing the scientific method. So I love that you were an example to youngsters about being a scientist, and particularly being a woman of color, being like, math is my first language. I love it, right? Because there's a few of us where we'll be like, that's not my first language. I'm happy it's yours, but it's not mine. But again, all of these things are important because it's important for our students to see these in us, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of skill set, and your knowledge of the working of education. So now let's move to the four-year institution. So I know that you are with your current institution and you've been, a high value resource to them, and you've had a great time at your university, and everything's going great, right? What I want to talk to you about is, if anyone were to look at your profile, they see that, yes, you're a scientist and you're a researcher, you've got publications, but you also are a journal editor. And sometimes people are reluctant to explore those opportunities or even take them on. And so, how did you end up being a journal editor?
So of course, you don't just wake up one day and become a journal editor, right? I want to say,
Right?
uh,
No.
I tend to travel the road less traveled, understanding that these are things that are less traveled for obvious reason. There's a reason why. And one of those routes I'd say is as a reviewer. Everyone wants their pieces reviewed, and nobody wants to be a reviewer. And so, and I understand it's time constraints, everyone's busy, but that has to be a two-way street. You have to review if you expect to have your pieces reviewed. And so even as a student, I started my doctoral program. I got my EDS 2014, 15. I started my doctoral program in 2016. And I just remember looking at, there were 6 things. I wish I knew them of the top of my head, but I don't. The 6 things you need to do to be doctoral, to remain doctoral. And I remember reviewing was one of the ones towards the end. And I said, well, if it's so important to have your papers reviewed, who's doing the reviewing? And I add that caveat because that's where it began. Being a consistent reviewer, taking every opportunity, no, but taking advantage of the opportunities where I know I align, and thinking about, well, if I don't review this piece, I'm going to leave it out there to be in someone else's hands. And how is that responsible? Is that responsible of me to do to anybody? I wouldn't want them doing that to me. And so starting in 2016, reviewing consistently, not constantly, consistently,
So
maybe
let me
sporadic.
ask you a question about that, just for practical purposes. So we're saying reviewing, right, and reviewer, and people may or may not know what that means. And so when you are a reviewer, that means that you have either been invited or you have reached out to a journal and said, I'm available to review manuscripts that are submitted for publication. And
Yes.
so you look at them for content, and so when we're talking about editorial, we're not talking about, formatting per se, but some of that may happen because people just send it in and then they send it to you and then you review it. But really, what is the content? How does it flow? What are the research methods, et cetera? So that is what a reviewer does.
Yes.
How did you become a reviewer?
Well, that went back to being a doctoral student and understanding, because one of the things I knew was that you need to publish. I know you need to get
Mm-hmm.
papers out, but what I didn't know was that just in signing up for journals and just starting that, opening up those lines of communication, they're going to find you as well. Because
Yes.
there's a little box on the end of every, when you sign up to, you create an account with any journal, there's a little box that says whether or not you're available to be a reviewer. And I want to believe that people elect maybe to uncheck that box every now and again. I and whether I like to or not, I do it because I want to have that two-way street. I want to have that relationship. I don't send my paper to you expecting that some phantom person out there is going to review, but then when it's my turn, I suddenly don't have the time, right? And being consistent in that way, because that's one of those thankless jobs. You don't really get accolades and acclaim for reviewing pieces, but no better way to see what a journal expects, what a good paper looks for. A lot of times you'll see what's missing. This is great,
Right.
but definitely what's missing. And these are the ways in which I took those skills and made my own papers better by way of, oh, I need to make sure that I do this with every paper now. And again, that was just where the two-way street began. So before I became an editor-in-chief, I was invited to be on the editorial board of the Police Practice and Research Journal, where I remain today since 2020. And that was a great segue, being an editorial board member and just having the responsibility along with the name placeholder, which is fun, but the work involved in reviewing pieces and meetings and just making sure everyone remains aligned. Yeah, we might think this is our vision and our mission, but every year we need to revisit that to make sure we're on the same page. And so that began in 2020. Then the invitation came from Jay Larry, a wonderful journal, the Journal of Legal, Ethical, and Regulatory Issues. They sent in, they contacted me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and sent me an email. And so I tend to take people more seriously when they use multiple modes of communication to reach out to me. It's telling me you're not going to stop. You're intentional about reaching out to me, and I appreciate that. So even when
Yeah.
oh boy, another thing to do, more work, not necessarily, I'm paying attention to how you reached out to me. And I did my homework. I saw who they were. I saw that they were listed in Hein Online. I follow it as well on Google Scholar. So every time a new notification comes in, I get it immediately. And so I did my homework before reaching back out to them to, initiate conversation, finding the alignment, looking at, again, this is legal, ethical, and regulatory issues. There's no way that doesn't align with what I myself am here to do. And so that made the decision easy for me to accept the invitation. And I've been editor-in-chief now of that journal since August of 2023.
So congratulations on that. I really appreciate and see the strategy that was involved. And so I want to remind people that, the practical steps are, hey, you're submitting stuff. I get it, even if you're not, because some institutions don't require you to do a lot of publications or maybe even any. The scholarship can look a little different. But in order to sort of, have a well-rounded dossier or portfolio when you're talking about career advancement, the reason that being a reviewer is great is, well, there's several. Dr. Johnson just listed them, right? You will be submitting and you get, somebody's going to be reviewing your stuff. So there's some reciprocity there, right? Some service, right? So if you listed on your CV, it would go under the area of scholarship and service, okay? The other thing is you get to see what other people are submitting. And when I was a reviewer, there were times when I would be reviewing things and I was like, what is this? This is like, what? No, that's not coming through. Right. And one of the things that I was also mindful of is that I had been in positions before where I submitted things and it was just a hard no, and there was no feedback. So I was like, what, was it that much of a mismatch? Or even if it was, could you just give me some parameters, right? So the categories when you are a reviewer are the, accept with edits, or edits and then review or reject, right? And in all of those, the reviewer has the option to provide feedback. And I think it's always important to just put something in there. So that's how you become a reviewer. Those are just some insights on it. And then and journals will ask you like, well, how many can you take annually? Because the agreement is usually that you would sit on as a reviewer for a year at a time. You can re-up, you can come off, etc. And so I would say most will give you about 4 a year. And you always let them know what your availability is. The turnaround time is within 30 days or so. If you need more time, then you just let them know. And then after you do that, sometimes at the end of that year, depending on how engaged you've been, they may invite you to be on the editorial board. Some take longer, some, are like, oh, wow, this person's really engaged. And that looks really good on your CV, right? Now, Dr. Johnson has gone to a whole nother level where she is the editor-in-chief, right? So that means she's been doing a lot of reviewing, that she's been very engaged, and they completely value everything that she's done. And when you're the editor-in-chief, like she mentioned, you can make sure that the journal is sticking to its mission, that you don't have this, mission drift and all the whole bunch of other stuff. So the other thing that I want to point out about this is, in terms of career advancement, this is a leadership position, right? So it affords you the opportunity to have leadership in a scholarly position, right?
Absolutely.
Outside of your university. So that also gives you connections to other people in other places and spaces that you may not necessarily bump into, right? Whether that's, in the same room or in the same department, in the same arena, or even in the same country, right? So it broadens your network. So we've got a bunch of things that you all know that I'm talking about regularly on the podcast. Is like, here are some concrete things that you can do to demonstrate leadership, scholarship, community engagement, building your network. You never know who you're going to meet. You never know how these things are going to fit together, but there are certainly opportunities that you can take advantage of. So, Dr. Johnson, you have given us a lot of great information about your path to the editor in chief. And I really appreciate this. And, as we sort of come to the end of our time together, can you give our listeners, I would say, two practical things that they could think about in terms of career advancement as it relates to sort of this area that people don't always think about? And if they do think about it, they're like, I don't have time to do one more thing.
And I understand this. I understand it, like we all understand this. We're all busy, but that's why you need to be intentional, and you need to be focused on what it is you are prioritizing. In the midst of busy, in the sea of busy, what matters the most? Because everything doesn't. Everything is not top priority, and that's the good news. You might want to start with identifying the three things that are on the podium. What three things make the podium? What's my gold? What's my silver? What's my bronze? Because then that helps reduce some of that other noise. Once you're identifying those three things, okay, these are my top three priorities, you can always work within those parameters. Okay, today this might be first, second, third, but everything isn't. And so again, in the sea of busy, it is so important to be focused and being intentional about what it is you need to do. We're all academics, we're all higher ed, we're all researchers, we're all scholars, we're all wonderful. We have all these wonderful accolades. But again, what is your priority? So even myself, for example, as a STEM gem, I'm in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and one of the classes I teach is stats, for example. I have never, ever lost that. Among the pieces I review, I always review at least 1 to 2 math pieces a year, and these are the things that really keep my arsenal, keep me ready. So when I do get a communication from someone, and it may seem random, it isn't. This is someone who has been following that history for maybe a decade or two or more, and it's the consistency that's going to be what matters at the end of the day. Not tomorrow, not next year. Why you're here, why you're doing what you are doing, what your commitment is, the fabric that you're creating and that you're part of, that no one can ever take from you. Just always remembering that that is your why.
I so appreciate that advice. So we want to be intentional. We want to identify the goals. And if we loop those together, if we keep our sort of what people would say, their North Star or their goal or their route, right? This is who I am. This is where I want to go. and making sure that everything is in alignment is what will help you move through your career and even life for that matter in a way that brings you some joy. And so I so appreciate you, and this conversation has brought me joy. And I thank you, Dr. Johnson, for spending some time with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I hope this is the first but not the last opportunity we have to align. This has been a pleasure for me as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you all. I am Dr. Loren M. Hill, your academic career advancement coach. Be sure to subscribe and like us and share all this great information.